Morning arrived slowly over Haven. The sky was covered in thick gray clouds, and the cold air carried the smell of smoke and wet earth. After the explosion of the dam and the massive flood that followed, the valley looked like a battlefield that nature itself had tried to erase. Mud covered everything. The once green fields were gone, replaced by broken trees, overturned vehicles, and debris scattered across the land like pieces of a shattered world. Small fires still burned in the distance. On the outer wall of Haven, survivors worked quietly, repairing the damage the flood had caused. Wooden barricades were being reinforced with metal plates. Pieces of wrecked cars were dragged into place to strengthen the gates. Everyone moved with urgency, but no one spoke much. The message from the radio the night before had changed everything. 3 weeks. That was the time they had before the massive migrating horde arrived. Mark stood on the highest watchtower overlooking the valley. His hands gripped a pair of old binoculars that had been used so many times the metal edges were worn smooth. He hadn't slept. None of the guards had. The flood had destroyed thousands of zombies, but it had also reshaped the valley in ways no one fully understood yet. Mark slowly scanned the horizon. At first, everything looked still. Broken. Silent. Then he saw movement. Far beyond the muddy valley, where the forest began again, something dark shifted across the distant hills. At first it looked like a shadow. But shadows didn't move like that. Mark adjusted the binoculars and focused. The movement spread slowly across the tree line. Dozens of figures. Then hundreds. His stomach tightened. He lowered the binoculars. "Lena," he called down the ladder. A moment later, Lena climbed up onto the platform. Her jacket was still soaked from working outside with the repair crews. "What is it?" she asked. Mark handed her the binoculars without speaking. "Look." She lifted them to her eyes. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she slowly lowered the binoculars again. "That's not just the survivors of the flood." Mark shook his head. "No, it's the beginning." The zombies that had survived the flood were already regrouping. And this time, there were more of them coming from the forest. Inside Haven, life moved in a strange rhythm between fear and determination. Some people were fixing walls. Others were sorting through the wreckage that the flood had carried into the settlement. Children were gathered in the central building where a few volunteers tried to keep them calm with quiet games and stories. Everyone understood that Haven was no longer safe. But no one knew where else they could go. In the medical building, Sarah carefully wrapped a bandage around the arm of one of the injured patrol members. Her own leg was still in a splint from the night before. "You should be resting," Tom said as he leaned against the doorway. Sarah gave him a tired smile. "If I rest, who treats the rest of you idiots?" Tom chuckled quietly, but the smile didn't last long. "How bad is it?" he asked. Sarah glanced at the list of injured survivors on the table beside her. "We lost 7 people last night." Tom lowered his head. "And the patrol? 2 missing. Probably dead." Silence filled the room. Outside, the sound of hammers hitting metal echoed through the settlement. Tom finally spoke again. "We might not be here much longer anyway." Sarah looked up. "The radio." Tom nodded. "They're sending a helicopter tonight." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Rescue, maybe." Tom walked to the window and looked out at the damaged walls of Haven. "Or maybe something worse." Far from Haven, deep within the dark forest to the north, something massive was moving. The trees trembled slightly as thousands of feet shuffled through the undergrowth. Birds that had once lived in the forest had long since disappeared. Now the only sound was the low, endless moan of the undead. The mega horde had been moving for weeks. Slow, unstoppable, like a river of rotting flesh flowing across the land. At the front of the horde walked thousands of ordinary zombies. But deeper inside the mass, things had begun to change. Some of the undead moved faster. Others seemed strangely aware of their surroundings. The infection had been evolving, mutating, and the flood in Haven's Valley had accelerated that change. Several kilometers ahead of the horde, a group of strange figures ran silently through the forest. They were zombies, but not like the others. Their bodies were twisted, muscles swollen, movements quick and aggressive. They were scouts, and they were moving toward Haven. On a rocky hill overlooking the ruined valley, the convoy of military trucks had stopped again. From this distance, Haven looked small, fragile. The leader of the mysterious soldiers studied the settlement through a high-powered scope. He could see the repair crews, the watchtowers, the smoke rising from the fires. "They're stronger than I expected," he said quietly. One of the soldiers beside him checked a tablet showing drone footage of the surrounding area. "But they won't survive the horde." The leader lowered the scope. "That's not our concern." The soldier frowned. "Then why are we here?" The leader smiled slightly. "Because Haven sits on the only high ground in this valley." He pointed toward the massive muddy basin created by the flood. "When the mega horde arrives, this will be the only defensible position for kilometers." Understanding slowly spread across the soldier's face. "You want to take Haven?" The leader nodded. "Exactly." Behind them, the convoy engines started again. The trucks rolled slowly down the hill toward the settlement. As the sun began to set, Haven prepared for the arrival of the helicopter. Fires were lit along the outer wall to make the settlement easier to see from the sky. People gathered in the central courtyard. Some looked hopeful, others looked terrified. Mark climbed down from the watchtower and joined Lena near the gate. "You think they'll really take us?" she asked. "I don't know," Mark admitted. "But if they have helicopters, they must have a real base. Maybe a safe zone." Lena looked toward the distant mountains. "Or maybe just another group trying to survive." Before Mark could respond, a distant sound reached them. At first it was faint, barely noticeable above the wind. Then it grew louder, a deep rhythmic pounding in the sky. Helicopter blades. People in the courtyard began pointing upward. The sound grew stronger. Hope spread through the crowd like electricity. After months of isolation, someone had finally come. The sound of the helicopter grew louder every second. The survivors of Haven gathered in the central courtyard, looking up at the dark sky. For many of them, it had been months since they had seen any aircraft. The world had gone silent after the outbreak. No planes, no helicopters, no help, until now. The powerful beam of a searchlight suddenly cut through the clouds. The helicopter appeared above the settlement, its rotors thundering through the cold evening air. People began shouting with excitement. Some waved their arms. Others simply stared in disbelief. Mark stepped forward, shielding his eyes from the bright light. The helicopter circled the settlement once, slowly. It looked military. Dark gray, heavy armor plates along the sides. Definitely not something a small survivor group could maintain. Lena stepped beside Mark. "That's not just a rescue helicopter," she said quietly. "No," Mark replied. "That belongs to a real base." The helicopter hovered above Haven's walls. A voice suddenly boomed through loudspeakers mounted beneath the aircraft. "This is Outpost Raven. If you can hear this, signal your landing zone." Mark quickly grabbed a flare gun from one of the guards. He fired it straight into the air. The bright red flare shot upward, leaving a trail of sparks behind it. The helicopter pilot responded immediately. The aircraft moved toward the open field just outside Haven's gate. Dust and debris exploded across the ground as the helicopter slowly descended. For the first time in months, hope filled the air. But hope didn't last long. From the distant hills beyond the valley, a convoy of trucks rolled slowly through the darkness. Their headlights were off, engines quiet. The mysterious soldiers had arrived. Inside the lead truck, the scar-faced leader watched the helicopter descending toward Haven. "So Raven finally found them," he said calmly. One of his men asked, "Do we attack now?" The leader shook his head. "Not yet." He watched the helicopter land near the settlement walls. "Let them think they're being rescued." A cruel smile crossed his face. "Then we take everything." Behind them, more trucks joined the convoy. Armed soldiers checked their weapons. Heavy machine guns rotated into firing position. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to claim Haven. The helicopter finally landed. Dust swirled around the field as the powerful rotors slowed. Mark and Lena cautiously walked toward the aircraft with several armed guards. The side door opened. Two soldiers jumped out first, weapons ready. They scanned the area quickly. Then a third figure stepped out. A tall man wearing a worn military uniform. His face looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. "You must be the leaders here," he said. Mark nodded. "I'm Mark. This is Lena." The soldier introduced himself. "Captain Hayes. Outpost Raven." Lena looked toward the north. "You said the mega horde is coming." Hayes nodded slowly. "It's bigger than anything we've seen." "How big?" Mark asked. The captain hesitated. Then he answered, "Millions." The word hung in the air. Even the guards standing nearby looked uneasy. Hayes continued, "The dam slowed part of it down, but the main body is still moving south." "How long do we have?" Lena asked. 2 weeks. Mark exchanged a worried look with her. "That's less time than we thought." Hayes nodded. "That's why we came. We can evacuate some of you." Not all. The hope in the crowd behind them began to fade. 200 survivors lived in Haven. A helicopter could only carry a few at a time. Then suddenly, gunfire echoed from the hills. Everyone froze. The captain turned immediately. "What the hell was that?" Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness. Bullets slammed into the outer wall of Haven. The convoy of trucks burst from the forest, engines roaring. Machine guns opened fire. People screamed and ran for cover. Mark grabbed his rifle. "Ambush!" Captain Hayes shouted to his soldiers. "Defensive positions." The helicopter pilot quickly powered the rotors again, preparing for emergency takeoff. But the attackers were already too close. One of the trucks mounted a heavy gun and unleashed a stream of bullets toward the helicopter. Metal sparks flew from the aircraft. The pilot shouted through the radio, "We're taking hits." Mark fired toward the approaching trucks. "Who the hell are these guys?" Captain Hayes answered grimly. "Not survivors. Raiders." The convoy spread across the valley floor. Armed soldiers jumped from the trucks, advancing toward Haven. But they weren't the only threat. Because the gunfire had awakened something else in the darkness. From the ruined valley, shapes began moving. At first only a few. Then dozens. Then hundreds. The sound of gunfire had drawn the dead once again. Zombies crawled from the mud left behind by the flood. Others stumbled through the broken forest. But among them, something faster moved. The mutated zombies. The ones the patrol had seen. One of them suddenly sprinted toward the attacking soldiers. Before the raider could react, the creature tackled him to the ground. Screams filled the battlefield. Now three sides were fighting. Haven's defenders, the raiders, and the dead. Captain Hayes looked at Mark. "We need to get your people inside." Mark nodded. "Everyone to the walls." The settlement gates slammed shut. Searchlights lit up the valley. And the battle for Haven truly began. Gunfire echoed across the valley. The raiders tried to push toward the gates. But now the zombies were attacking them as well. Several soldiers were dragged into the mud by the undead. One of the trucks exploded when a fuel tank was hit by a stray bullet. Flames lit up the battlefield. Inside Haven, survivors fired from the walls. Mark aimed carefully and dropped another raider climbing the barricade. Beside him, Lena reloaded her rifle. "This is insane," she shouted. Hayes agreed. "We're in the middle of a three-way war." But the worst part hadn't arrived yet. Because in the far distance, beyond the hills, a dark line was forming. The mega horde was closer than anyone realized. The fighting continued deep into the night. Some raiders retreated. Others were overwhelmed by zombies. But Haven had taken damage. The walls were cracked. A watchtower had collapsed. And ammunition was running low. Mark climbed the tower ruins and looked toward the horizon. What he saw made his blood run cold. The forest itself seemed to be moving. The mega horde had finally reached the valley. Millions of undead, marching toward Haven. Lena climbed beside him. "What do we do now?" Mark stared into the endless mass of moving corpses. Then he spoke quietly. "We survived tonight." He looked back at the burning battlefield. "Because tomorrow, the real war begins." The wind blew across the ruined valley. Smoke drifted through the cold night air as the fires from the battle slowly died down. On the broken watchtower, Mark and Lena stood silently, staring into the distance. Far beyond the hills, the ground seemed to move. Not from wind, not from shadows, but from millions of walking corpses. The mega horde had finally arrived. A dark ocean of the dead stretching across the horizon. Lena tightened her grip on her rifle. "We can't fight that," she whispered. Mark didn't answer right away. He watched the endless tide of undead marching slowly toward Haven. Then he spoke quietly. "We don't have to win. We just have to survive." Behind them, the survivors of Haven prepared for the longest night of their lives. Weapons were loaded, barricades reinforced, Fires lit along the walls. Because everyone understood the truth now. The battle for Haven had only just begun. And tomorrow, the world might finally fall. If you want to see what happens next in the fight for Haven, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of the apocalypse. Because the story isn't over yet. The dead are coming, and the survivors are running out of time.